to tonight's event called Rising Profits, Sinking Planet, Socialist Solutions to the Climate Crisis. It's being put on by Haymarket Books and co-sponsored by the International Socialist Organization. Haymarket Books is a non-profit radical publishing company, and they believe that we need the ideas and history and politics today to bring into the movements that we're participating in. And they put out Chris's book and a book that Amity contributed to. So tonight we're proud to host Chris Williams and Amity Paye. Chris Williams is a longtime environmental activist and author of Ecology and Socialism. He's a professor of physics and chemistry at Paye University. He's been featured in a number of publications. He also reported from Fukushima after the nuclear crisis. He has an article published in this month's Socialist Worker newspaper on Hurricane Sandy. Then we have Amity Paye, who is a Boston native, who is a writer and journalist in New York City. She writes for Amsterdam News, and she covered Hurricane Sandy in New York. She's also a contributor to Occupying Wall Street, the inside story of an action that changed America, also put out by Haymarket Books. She'll be speaking about her experiences reporting on Hurricane Sandy. So the way this is going to go is we're going to have Amity speak, we're going to have Chris Williams speak, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. And after the forum, we're going to have Chris Williams do a book signing, so stick around for that. Pick up a copy from the Haymarket table. Amity's book, unfortunately, we don't have it here tonight, but if you go over to the Haymarket table, you can purchase it tonight, and we'll ship it to you for free. So, yeah, with that, we will start with Amity.
My notes on my phone, so if I'm looking down, it's still for you guys. So I wanted to just start and sort of retell one of my first experiences, and probably one of the worst experiences I had covering Hurricane Sandy. When Hurricane Sandy hit, it was a Tuesday. I live in Harlem, and I was telling someone earlier, we were very minimally hit up where I was on 145th Street. So, you know, I tried to go to work the morning after, and everything was closed, and that didn't really work. But what it showed me is that everything seemed normal, right? And I think that's sort of where we're getting now, is everything is starting to seem normal again, even in New York City, when really it's not. So the first time I went out, I was able to take a train, and I got to Brooklyn and Occupy Sandy, a group that had come together in the days right after Hurricane Sandy. They had created this hub where you could go with supplies or just with yourself if you wanted to help. And people would come and come with cars, and they would sort of caravan you out to wherever they had gotten calls that needed supplies, people, or just help in general. So I did that, and I went and I was taken with a group to Coney Island. And while we were there, that was the only way for me to really get out there as a journalist without my own car. And the group I was with delivered food to one woman in one public housing building on one floor, 8th floor. And we delivered a lot of food, and then realized when we got there that everyone else on the floor was still there. And they didn't have food or blankets or anything else that they needed. And it was sort of a shock, because in talking to them, I sort of turned into my journalism mode and started interviewing everyone. And in talking to them, this was about a week after the storm had hit, and they had seen no one. They had gotten no food, they still had no heat, no electricity. They were on the 8th floor of this public housing building, which is usually public housing, you've got a lot of people around that are either policing or monitoring in some way, and they had seen no one there at all to help them. And so sort of in talking to each one of them, that each person, we ended up knocking on all the doors of that one floor. And it was a 25-story building. So you start to get a feel for sort of how insignificant like a group of 5 people feel, right? And we found that pretty much everyone needed help or medical assistance or food or something, and sort of went back and reported this to Occupy Sandy. Then for me, I've got a 9 to 5, so I went back to work the next day and started calling all the city officials that I can get in touch with just through the press. And the group that I had originally went out with started a group called, and I hadn't known all of them beforehand. I knew about 2 of them, and it was a group of like 5 to 8 of us depending on the time. So they ended up going to Coney Island every day and starting a group called the People's Relief. And the next time that I went to the People's Relief, which was stationed in Coney Island and ended up working out of a church, it was sort of even worse experience in that I got there, and again I was trying to report and talk to everyone, but it was just sort of mayhem and I didn't feel like that was useful. So I just started sort of watching and helping where I could. And what they were doing is volunteers were coming in and they were sending them out to just door knock. They were sending them out with like backpacks and cars full of stuff. And what they were doing is bringing all of this stuff up to the 20th floor of the buildings and then working their way down and door knocking on every door they could. And then writing reports and bringing them back or calling in if it was an emergency. And it was terrifying. The calls that we were getting, I was there in the call center for maybe an hour. And the first call I got was they found a woman who was supposed to be on dialysis and hadn't been able to get treatment for 6 days. And had to carry her down in the dark down the stairs. I think she was on the 15th floor, 15th or 16th. They carried her down the stairs and got her to an ambulance. There was one floor where there was an elderly woman that they couldn't find, and they didn't know if her family had come and gotten her or if she was still in her apartment and just couldn't get to the door or what have you. That type of situation where you're worried that someone could be dead. There were, and still again, remember no power, no electricity, all of that is still in play 2 weeks after the storm. And down to I had one group bring me a pile of papers that said, their report back said that the security guards at the building wouldn't let them in because there was a methane gas leak. But residents were unaware of that. And the building was still full of people living in it, and they just wouldn't let relief efforts in to help them. So that was all in the span of a couple hours and sort of kept me coming back. And then thinking of that, looking at the sort of wider lay of the land, people were saying that they still hadn't seen, 2 weeks later, they still hadn't seen FEMA. They still hadn't seen the Red Cross. Some people did say the Red Cross had a station in Coney Island, but they weren't going into the buildings. So for a lot of the elderly people or homebound people we were talking to, they could literally see the Red Cross trucks outside with food and couldn't get to the food, and hadn't been brought food into their buildings for weeks. So in terms of public housing, the city's public housing authority was not present at all 2 weeks after. And the only people that they reported seeing, that I was getting, anyone that I spoke to, the only people they had really seen were people that were in these grassroots groups that really had no experience doing that at all. They just were, concerned people and ended up staying. And so it's sort of ridiculous, right? It's like you've got all these people with all this money that are supposed to be doing this and are trained to do it, and they just weren't there. Mm-hmm. So in terms of Sandy, and in talking about environmental racism, Sandy was not like a natural disaster at all. It wasn't at all. It was really a social disaster. So if you, I think it was just a couple days. It was 2 or 3 days, and the financial district was back up and running.
Right.
And that's in one of the lowest lying parts of Manhattan. Right. So if you look at, they got the money back up and running as soon as they possibly could. where they didn't even think about everyone else, and in some regards they're still not really thinking about them. So what's also interesting about it, which is I was seeing so I would spend like a day in the field and then go back to work and call everyone, right? So I'm calling the mayor's office, the governor's office, the heads of FEMA for Manhattan and Brooklyn, and getting them to give me statements. And what was really interesting is that they actually knew that they were messing up. And the reason I know that is because they just lied. They just lied about all of it. They told me that they were doing everything. I knew that they weren't. Like you could see on the ground that they weren't doing it. So like a really good example of that is I was told by the mayor's office that all of the volunteer efforts were coordinated by the city. I was told on the record that it was a misconception that people weren't seeing the city because all the volunteer efforts were the city, and if anyone knows anything about Occupy Wall Street, they're not coordinated by the city. So that's pretty obvious that it wasn't. I was told by someone from the public housing. I was told by someone from the Public Housing Authority that they were conducting door-to-door knocks to just check on people and provide health care to people in every single public housing building.
Wow.
I was told that, and that was clearly untrue because the day before I was actually in a meeting where someone from the FEMA and also someone from the Public Housing Authority had sat down with a group in Coney Island and asked them if they needed cadaver dogs to go with their volunteers to check on the buildings that they were checking on. So pretty much in essence what they were saying is, you know, we're not doing this, so do you need our cadaver dogs to make sure that people aren't dead? And so for the city, or for FEMA to tell me the next day, right, for the Public Housing Authority NYCHA to tell me the next day that they were doing that when they clearly were asking the grassroots organizations if they could just sort of give them the resources to do it themselves, right, was ridiculous. So I kept running into that every time. Pretty much every time I spoke to someone in any public official's office or anyone from the federal government, it was all just either they were misinformed because they were on the top and people were telling them that things were going on that weren't, or they were lying. It was one of the two. So once they finally did start doing something, right, and it took them a while. I was told by FEMA, I was assigned my own FEMA rep because they started to see some of the reporting that I was putting out. And someone showed up at the Amsterdam News to sort of play reconnaissance, I suppose.
Wow.
And I was told by my FEMA rep that they had been told to stand down for the first week of the hurricane because there was an oyster coming and it wouldn't be safe for them, which again makes no sense. But I eventually got FEMA to take me out with them so I could actually see what they were doing. And what I found was that they were checking on property and not on people.
Wow.
So this was about 2 weeks ago. I finally went out with FEMA for them to show me what they were doing. And they were, I went out to Far Rockaway, which was a place that I had been for my own reporting and sort of covering what grassroots groups were doing out there. There was a group of kids that were doing amazing work out there. And they were door knocking at all the private residences, privately owned buildings. And I was told by the group that they were not door knocking in the public housing buildings that were right next door. And that they had left the material with the doorman, and that there was a different group, of course, right? Not their group, but a different group had gone into the public housing building and checked on everyone. And what they were delivering to people was information about loans. So you could get like low interest loans if your house, like if your insurance company couldn't, pay for everything, or They were asking if they had already applied for the grants, and most people hadn't even seen FEMA yet. It was really interesting because they brought me along to see what they were doing, but they were checking on people that hadn't been seen by FEMA for a month.
Wow.
So, yeah, but they were delivering information about property. They weren't checking on the people, if they were alive, if they were healthy, if they were receiving the needs, the things that they needed. It was all about their home and rebuilding their homes. And I think a really good quote that sort of exemplifies how New York City thought of that was that the governor said that Hurricane Sandy was worse than Hurricane Katrina because there was more property damage. And he said that in like this big press conference, and all of the, all of the big TV stations put it on their nightly news, right? When obviously Katrina had more deaths, and so you start to see where things are important. The last thing that I really saw was that for the public housing, and that's where I really stuck. That's where I sort of stayed and started to stick with, because it was where everything was the worst. In the public housing, I was told by a police officer in Far Rockaway that the police were afraid to go into the public housing buildings because there was no electricity and their security cameras were down. I was told by a FEMA rep that they weren't sending women into the public housing buildings because it wasn't safe for them. By local residents that the people in the public housing were doing all the looting. So it's sort of this like switch, right? This thing that didn't switch, right? Where like they're used to policing these spaces, and it also becomes clear that they're not policing them to keep the people inside safe. They're policing them to keep the people outside safe, right? And once that policing system failed, because if you don't have electricity, that fails. They just recriminalize them in different ways. So the people that were like previously like drug dealers and like welfare moms just became the looters and the freeloaders, right? Like they just switched the way they criminalized them to fit the new situation that they had. And what that meant is they got less help. Clearly, they got a lot less help. And so in terms of safety, they were a lot less safe, even though these are places that are the most policed and the places that they keep the safest, right, that they claim to do that in. So yeah, that was all really clear with Sandy, and is still, I mean, I was out last two Mondays ago, and there were still people without electricity in Coney Island and in Staten Island. So it really gets to be sort of these dire situations where people's lives are at stakes when for everyone else in Lower Manhattan that went through the same situation, it's not. And then you get into this whole sort of relief culture where services are being funneled in when a lot of the needs were actually there before. So while everyone is bringing food, why do you need, why is it important to get public transportation back up if no one has a job, right? Like, why is it important, to have people check on someone's health if typically they can't afford healthcare? So as soon as the relief effort is over, they're back to not having any healthcare at all. So that's sort of where you get into while relief efforts after an environmental or social disaster like this happens, everyone rushes in and gives, but it's not sustainable all the time. And I think that's really what you're starting to see now. Just as you need sustainable ways to protect a city, all of a city, you need sustainable ways to protect the people in it too.
That was amazing. Really disturbing. So now we're going to throw it to Chris, who's going to kind of touch on the bigger picture of this climate crisis and where it's coming from.
So, if it wasn't already obvious to people, from what Amity was just telling us, Hurricane Sandy, the impact of Hurricane Sandy was class and race based, and the solutions that they're coming up with are also class and race based, so that Ian Murray, who writes for Forbes and is part of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, wrote an article, Hurricane Sandy and the Invisible Hand of Disaster Recovery, where he argued that New Yorkers would have a problem with recovering from Hurricane Sandy adequately for two reasons. And one of those reasons was that New Yorkers had not allowed big box stores into Manhattan. And they were the solution and the answer to cleaning up after Hurricane Sandy. And secondly, because Walmart is just itching to help people if you only let them into your town. And as we've seen with the strikes against Walmart by their workers recently. And the second reason was we had these really restrictive regulations in place that said that anybody who went to work for the government or had a contract with the local government had to pay the prevailing wage. In other words, they had to pay union wages, and this was going to depress efforts to help out. So, as he said, I quote, "Disaster response provides an excellent example of how the invisible hand of the market works to alleviate suffering and bring quick relief to those in need. Big box stores don't merely sit and wait. They get out first and help people. Big government, on the other hand, can get in the way. The cleanup process might be hindered by pro-union rules such as the Davis-Bacon Act, which increases the cost of federally funded construction products. It will be interesting to see whether the lack of big box stores in Manhattan has any effect on the speed of recovery there." So that's why we're suffering now, not because the government's not doing anything and going out to the places in need, and once they've got what they care about up and running again, they forget about everybody else. No, it's because we didn't allow in Walmart. Writing in the New York Times, Russell Sobel said what he wanted to see was a FEMA that established, quote, free trade zones in New York, in which all normal regulations, licensing and taxes were suspended, and in which buyers and sellers felt secure and protected. That would better provide the goods and services victims need. So what we should do is abolish all laws. The only role for the police and the military is to go into these areas to allow people to sell what people are desperate for, food and water, at any price they feel like, and then the ensuing riot, the police will be there to make sure that that can go on safely. And so that was in the New York Times published. And so, this is obviously just a microcosm of what's going on in the world in totality. So we have a billionaire mayor who in 2009 said, quote, "Planning for climate change today is less expensive than building an entire network after the catastrophe. We cannot wait until after our infrastructure has been compromised to begin to plan for the effects of climate change now." And so that was 3 years ago. Obviously he didn't heed his own advice, though he did publish this on his magazine 1 week after Hurricane Sandy, and practically the same day that he endorsed somebody who'd never mentioned climate change in any of the debates or for the preceding 3 years either. So on the one hand you could say, well, maybe the ruling elite is waking up to the reality of what they're doing to the world. On the other hand, our billionaire mayor just bought, you'll be happy to know, his fourth house in Westchester. He actually has 12 houses, three in Manhattan, one in Colorado, one in Florida, one in Barbados, one in London. So probably Bloomberg's biggest decision that he had to make was, where am I going to evacuate to during the storm? So it was costed out. I mean, this is the kind of sick society that we really live in, because it was costed out. Well, what would it take to build these gigantic seawalls and barriers that they're talking about building, which is a mad idea, really, because if you block water from going one place, it's going to go somewhere else. But they seem to have overlooked that. Anyway, apart from the at least 2 decades before anything like that would be able to be built, and what do we do in the meantime, that was costed out at, if you wanted to go along with that plan, at $15 billion, which is, you know, a substantial amount of money. And yet, it is far less than what Bloomberg himself is actually calculated to be worth. So he is worth, apparently, as an individual, $25 billion. So he could save the entire New York City from climate change, theoretically, if he went along with that plan, and still be a multi-billionaire. In fact, it would have no impact on him if he gave $15 billion away to climate change-proof New York City, if he believed in that plan. So this is really where we are in terms of the city, and obviously there are far better plans, some of which I've written about, and some of which published high school students have written about as what they would do, which are far saner than building this kind of medieval fortress to protect us from the rising oceans, which they themselves are causing. And you can't say that New York was not warned about this. I mean, 12 months ago, almost to the day, Hurricane Irene came within 6 inches of doing exactly what Hurricane Sandy actually did do. And so, you know, when you lay a map of the toxic waste sites and production zones in New York City, you lay that over a map of Zone A, this now infamous Zone A, which is all flood prone, which you overlay a map of low-income housing and people of colour because of racism. Those 3 things go together. And so not only are people left in these areas, but they're left with not just seawater, but contaminated water on top of that. And so who knows what all the effects of all these things are going to be. And yet there are still no real plans to do anything about this. Despite the fact that now we know for certain that over the last 100 years of taking readings down at Battery Park of sea level, sea level has risen in New York City over the last 100 years by 12 inches, about an inch a decade, and that is speeding up. New York, on average now, is 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was 100 years ago. And so these are just facts, you can't dispute them. And so we know also that the Northeast is a regional hotspot for rising sea level that's rising at 40 to 60% higher than the rest of the planet. And all of these things are accelerating, and yet we just, Doha, the last round of international climate negotiations just ended last Saturday, and officially known as COP18, Conference of the Parties 18. What does the 18 stand for? 18 years. They've been negotiating for 18 years to come up with a solution to the only treaty that preceded that was supposedly legally binding, Kyoto. Kyoto expires this month, and so now there's nothing except for the fact that Kyoto was supposedly meant to reduce carbon dioxide emissions on average from the developed countries by 8%, and carbon emissions since the implementation of Kyoto in 1997 have increased globally by 50%. You know, all of this, you wrap all these things together, and it's pretty clear, I think, that we are finally, or not, I shouldn't say finally, but we are beginning to find out the limits to which the planet can absorb the punishment that it's taking without flipping into a completely new climatic state, one that we have never experienced in human civilization. Because the last 12,000 years or so of relatively benign, stable climate happened to coincide with the rise of human civilization, right? Us living in towns and settled communities. Because that means agriculture. And if you cannot predict what's going on with the climate, when it's going to rain, where it's going to rain, how much it's going to rain, etc., then you can't have agriculture. And so we are facing an absolutely critical point in terms of where we are now, because there are two systems, I would argue, that are in fundamental conflict with each other. One is the capitalist system, and the other is the climate system. And there is no indication, there's no evidence to indicate that capitalism is about to change. In fact, quite the opposite. So, a recent report, currently, the world consumes around about 85 million barrels of oil, thanks, every single day, which I think in and of itself, just that one statistic is kind of mind-blowing when you think that you've got 85 million barrels of oil every single day, 24/7, 365 days a year, that have to be extracted from the planet and set fire to, just so the next day you can do the exact same thing, and the day after, and the day after. Now, that number has to come down. All scientists agree that that number is predicted to increase to 110 million barrels by 2020. And that increase will largely come from the United States. As they're fracking their way around the country for natural gas, that means that they can also apply that technology to oil. So that Citibank just released a report arguing that the United States would become, quote, the new Middle East, that it would rival Saudi Arabia by 2020 in its output of fossil fuels, including biofuels and so on. And in the meantime, of course, natural gas has come down in price, which has actually started to displace coal. So, interestingly enough, the United States actually, its emissions have decreased, but not because we're using less fossil fuels, because we're using less coal. But is the world as a whole using less coal? No. Because what are they doing with the coal they can't sell in the United States? They are selling it to China. And so China is building coal plants built on US, fueled by US coal, except then the US political class gets to turn around and blame China for not stopping its emissions, and so therefore why should we? When it's all in fact based on US exports, which is why they're busily building more coal export docks on the west coast. You know, in amongst all of this, we have the World Bank, as people probably may well have heard. A big report came out from the World Bank saying that actually now the world, our planet, the only one we have, is on track for a 4 degrees C rise in global temperatures over the next 50 years or so. Now, any climate scientist is going to tell you that the maximum we can possibly endure and be in a world that resembles anything like the one that all of us grew up in is 2 degrees C. So the World Bank is now saying that we're on track for 4. And if I quote from their report, there is also no certainty that adaptation to a 4 degrees C world is possible. A 4 degrees C world is likely to be one in which communities, cities and countries would experience severe disruptions, damage and dislocation, with many of these risks spread unequally. It is likely that the poor will suffer most, and the global community could become more fractured and unequal than today. Hard to believe, but apparently true, according to the World Bank. The projected 4 degrees C warming simply must not be allowed to occur. The heat must be turned down. Now, this is the same organisation that up until 2011, 25% of its energy loans went to coal plants. And it is currently funding the construction of 29 new coal plants around the world. So, on the one hand, they're saying, well, look, this is terrible. This is about to happen. On the other hand, they're stuffing money into new coal plant production. So, I think that really highlights a quote from Eduardo Galeano. Crimes against people, crimes against nature. The impunity enjoyed by the masters of war is shared by their twins, the voracious masters of industry, who eat nature on earth and in the heavens swallow the ozone layer. The most successful companies in the world are the ones that do the most to murder it. The countries that decide the planet's fate are the same ones that do their best to annihilate it. So, and that, for me, and for Marx, is the essence of the way that capitalism operates in terms of the social exploitation that all of us suffer under is just the mirror image of the exploitation of the natural world. Because as Marx said, you need both things, both nature and labour, in order to bring them together for capitalism to operate. And this voracious system is built on not producing things that we need, but producing things that make the most amount of money in the shortest amount of time. And anything else is a secondary consideration to which they pay almost no attention. Secondly, this system is built on the premise of continual expansion. Therefore, when it's not expanding, as we see today, if it's not expanding at least 2 or 3% a year, then it's in crisis. And so there are cuts to social programs, layoffs, all the things that, unemployment, all the things that we see right here today. And we live on a finite planet, so there is a fundamental contradiction. As I mentioned, we are now at the limit of what the planet can absorb and maintain its biospheric integrity in ways that we understand. So 4 degrees C warmer would be warmer than any time in the last 30 million years. 4 degrees C colder, to give you a comparison, would be the Ice Age, 20,000 years ago. When where we are right now would be, we would be under a mile, between a mile and 2 miles of ice. And so unimaginable things, and not things that are in the far-off future for grandchildren or whatever, but clearly we are getting a taste of them right here today. I mean, we've had 2 hurricanes in New York in a 12-month period. Who knows what is going to happen next? And yet, despite the fact that New York and New Jersey have said, well, we need $80 billion in order to recover, despite that, there's no sense in which there is some real urgency about what we should be doing is mobilizing the entire society to change over to a system that we know, it's not like we don't have the answers, right? I would be depressed if we just did not know what to do, right? And we didn't, even if we did know what to do, the technology did not exist with which to do it. But this is entirely a social and a political question. It's got nothing to do with technology. Because we know solar panels work, we know wind farms work, we know distributed power works, and energy conservation, any number of other things that we could do, just in the energy sector, let alone the transportation sector. I mean, when you think about it, if you'd set out with your objective as making, I know, what I want to do is make the most inefficient and polluting way of getting around the city or the country possible, what would you invent? Well, you would invent an internal combustion engine and stick it in a car. Because cars are 95% of the time, any given car is not in use. So, look at all of the space that is taken up by cars and parking lots and all the rest of it, even when they're not being used. So 1/3 of some major cities in this country are taken up with non-residential parking space. In other words, concrete. And so with all of the ramifications that has in terms of runoff and so on and so forth. And then a car engine itself is only about 25% efficient. So even when it's running and poisoning us, right, with all of that noxious fumes, even when it's causing all kinds of respiratory ailments, cancers, etc., everything that we're currently dying from, then it's about 25% efficient. So, for every gallon of gas that you put in your car, 75% you might as well just set fire to. Therefore, the idea that we couldn't come up with some better way of getting ourselves around is madness, right? There's no way that that is possible when you think of the myriad ways that we could actually construct our buildings in a socially and ecologically sensible way in order to make travel between those buildings and work much more equitable and much more ecologically sustainable. And yet, of course, the car is the engine of capitalist growth and therefore cannot be sacrificed. So there was a report that I quote in my book, Scientific American, highlighted that what would you need to power the planet? What would you need to build? Because another statistic that was out a little bit later, that's not in the book, but the world uses about 15 trillion megawatts of 15 terawatts of power every second. So 15 terawatts. There's no reason why you would have any relationship to that number. But the sun, to give a comparison to that number, the sun gives out 101,000 terawatts of power. So we use 15, the sun provides 101,000. So we would only have to capture a tiny fraction of 1% of solar energy in order to power the world. And I'm not saying we would do that, right? We would have some mix and we would have a plan and things. But it gives you a sense of what's possible. So, thanks. So Scientific American said what we would need to do to change over from fossil fuels, I'm just using this as an example, would be build 3.8 million wind turbines and 90,000 solar arrays over a 20-year period, and then we could power the world, and everybody could have electricity, even though 1 billion people currently don't have it. 3.8 million wind turbines, well, that's a lot, but over a 20-year period. But we build 70 million cars every single year. So if you just switched from car production to wind turbines, as an example, you could easily do that with the existing factories. And so, like I said, the answers are all right there before us, and what is preventing us from taking them is the social system that we live under, that benefits so handsomely from the exploitation of the many by the few, and the exploitation of the natural world upon which we depend, but upon which they think we are entirely independent of. And we could exist, in fact, without, basically, a world upon which to live. And just to quote Marx, I think from which a lot of this is really taken, what he's writing about 150 years ago, I think, is much more reminiscent of our own time now. On the one hand, there have started into life industrial and scientific forces which no epoch of the former human history had ever suspected. On the other hand, there exist symptoms of decay far surpassing the horrors of the latter times, recorded of the latter times of the Roman Empire. In our days, everything seems pregnant with its contrary. Machinery, gifted with the wonderful power of shortening and fructifying human labour, we behold starving and overworking it. The newfangled sources of wealth, by some strange, weird spell, are turned into sources of want. The victories of art seem bought by the loss of character. At the same pace that mankind masters nature, man seems to become enslaved to other men or to his own infamy. Even the pure light of science seems unable to shine, but on the dark background of ignorance. All our invention and progress seem to result in endowing material forces with intellectual life and in stultifying human life into a material force. This antagonism between modern industry and science on the one hand, modern misery and dissolution on the other hand, this antagonism between the productive powers and the social relations of our epoch is a fact, palpable, overwhelming, and not to be controverted. And 150 years later, I think we see the end result of that on a planetary scale. We are wasting the minds of 7 billion people, most of whom never get to think about anything except surviving till the end of the day. Imagine what we could do if we freed 7 billion minds from that constant pressure of staying alive, and they could think creatively about their world. Imagine what we could do with all of us. Many people, probably, I have 2 jobs, probably many of you do, or 3 or whatever. Imagine what we could do. One of the central parts of what Marx argues in Capital is that nobody should be working more than 20 hours a week. And that 20 hours should be on socially useful things. And what would we do with the other time in order to fulfill ourselves intellectually, spiritually, psychologically? One of the things that we need to do is obviously get back into touch with nature. Most of us, all of us, are completely alienated, not only from ourselves, not only from each other, and from the thing that should bring us fulfillment, our jobs. But we're also alienated from nature too. We barely know what exists outside of cities. And in fact, if you go to the 2010 census, farmers don't appear as a demographic group anymore because there's less than 0.5% of the population who are now classified as farmers. And once you're less than 0.5%, you're not in the census anymore. So officially there are no farmers in the United States. And yet obviously we do depend on food. And at the same time as the East Coast was underwater, we've got the vast majority of the rest of the United States in a drought that continues, whereby Mississippi now, they're possibly, or they're talking about having to stop shipping in the Mississippi, which is 1/3 of internal trade, because it's too shallow. Right now, it's still in drought. And so we are facing some really devastating levels of dislocation. Thanks. And yet nothing seems to be done about it. And so what we need to do, I think, is operate on two different levels. On the first level, we have to fight for some real reforms, which means some action from the government, because it's not going to come, it's clearly not going to come from private industry. And the reason that we need to fight for some real reforms is because nothing is coming from anywhere else. I mean, really, we are given 3 rubrics under which solutions to climate change and ecological degradation are going to come. 1, there will be a technological answer, right? We will bury the CO2 underground, we will have clean coal, we will put mirrors in space to deflect sunlight. That's actually a real plan, by the way. We will seed the oceans with iron, also a real plan. All of this in order to carry on going with producing CO2. That's one thing that we could do. Or secondly, we are told that the market, the thing that brought us the problem in the first place, will also get us out of it. So cap and trade. That is the idea behind cap and trade. Or thirdly, we are the problem. Right? So individual lifestyle changes. We're the problem in the developed world because we consume too much. Or we are the problem in the developing world because they just keep having babies. And all of those 3 things, obviously, apart from being racist, let the system off the hook. So we have to actually put limits on the system's operation, which means fighting for genuine reforms and re-regulate the corporations and say they are the ones who have to pay. So, for example, Shell and Exxon this year have already made $54 billion in profit from destroying the planet, at the same time as they've claimed $800 million in tax relief from the government. And so we need to fight for some real reforms, which means building a mass movement. And I think a mass movement that has to build into itself not just the question of ecological justice, but also simultaneously the question of social justice. Because we're not actually going to get one without the other. The two are completely linked. And so we have to form that kind of movement that has the radicalism of the 1960s social movements with the organization and social power of the union movements of the 1930s. That's what we need to do in the short term. And if it's only 5 of us meeting in a room and talking about that, then it's 5 of us, and we are trying to get it to be 7 of us, and so on and so forth. I don't think that's where we're at. We're far ahead of that. We're living in a new world as of 2011, in my opinion. I think we're entering into a new era of revolt, rebellion, and revolution. And that means that we can do far more than we could possibly have conceived of prior to the Egyptian revolution, prior to Occupy, prior to Wisconsin. And all of that is bubbling up under the surface with Greece, with what's going on in this country, with what's going on around the world. Opens up new questions once again. But ultimately, also, I think we need a much bigger vision for what an equitable and sustainable world would really look like. What would we want if we could redesign Boston or any other city to build it for humans, for us, and not for cars? What would a city look like if you took, for example, just cars out of the equation and started building green space, connecting the city to the countryside, knowing where your food came from. I mean, most of the time you can't even call what we eat food anymore. And why is that? What would it mean to have sustainable agriculture that could absolutely feed the whole world? And what kind of thing would that vision really look like? And I think that that requires a complete reimagining of our future. That's what one of the other things that capitalism does to us. It narrows our mind to think within the confines of the current system. And the only way out is not only to start fighting back, but also to have a much bigger vision for change. Because we can all come up with utopian scenarios about what kind of world we want to live in, and that's in the kind of the last chapter of my book about what would a sustainable society really look like. But I think it's also about taking the fetters off our minds and having a much bigger and systemic look at a vision for the future. So I'll end with a quote from James Baldwin, who was writing in 1956 against William Faulkner on desegregation, and against Faulkner's argument that we should go slow with the question of desegregation. And he said, "Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring, one clings to what one knew, or thought one knew, to what one possessed or dreamed that one possessed. Yet, it is when a man is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream he has long cherished, or a privilege he had long possessed, that he is set free. He has set himself free, for higher dreams, for greater privileges." And I would just throw out there two things to consider with regard to that. One is, why do we need to own anything? What does that do to our human psyche to have the concept of mine versus yours? And this is something that Marx talks about in Volume 3 of Capital. What would it mean to own everything in common? I mean, when you think about it, when was the last time you ever heard anybody complain about libraries? You know, goddamn libraries. They let you take out books for free and read them. You know, what would it mean to apply that socialist, communist kind of concept across the board? When you think about it, how often do you really use your washing machine and dishwasher? An hour a week, maybe? What a waste, what a stupendous waste of resources that is. Or what about the idea that do we even need countries? These artificial lines on maps that we're supposed to fight each other over? Of course not. What would it mean to live without the need for money? What would it mean to completely redesign our living spaces to, instead of requiring air conditioning, build them so that they no longer needed it? All of these things are completely possible. But the only way we're going to do that, the only way we're going to have those things, if we see a social and ecological revolution, and I think that that is something worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. So now we're going to have